All right, so in the early 19th century, America had won its political revolution, which is great. But then came this deeper question. Now that it was a country, what was it, really? The battle for independence was over, but the quest to forge a truly American soul, that was just getting started.
And this was the central question facing the young nation. I mean, for generations, America's cultural compass had been stuck pointing east, right back to Britain and Europe for all its art, its literature, its philosophy. It was like they were a cover band. So with political independence, you get this profound identity crisis. How do you stop being a cultural echo and finally, find your own voice?
Well, the first big ingredient was this powerful surge of nationalism. After the War of 1812, this feeling of confidence and, just raw patriotism swept the nation. That was the fuel they needed for cultural independence. And what's really key to understand here is that we're not talking about the founding generation anymore. No, this was a whole new group of Americans, people born in the United States. Their focus wasn't on Europe's old, tired wars. It was on the vast, untamed continent stretching out right in front of them, to the west. And this nationalist spirit, it seeped into everything. I mean, you had art celebrating the heroes of the revolution, basically turning them into these larger-than-life mythic figures. You had this wildly popular biography of George Washington, which, let's be honest, took some liberties with the truth, but it cemented him as a national icon. And in classrooms, Noah Webster's famous speller wasn't just teaching kids their ABCs, it was standardizing an American language and weaving patriotism right into the fabric of education itself.
Okay, so patriotism gives you the energy, this spark, but it's not the blueprint, right? To actually build a unique culture, you need a unique philosophy. And the intellectual engine for this massive change was this kind of radical new movement born up in New England called Transcendentalism.
And you really can't overstate how radical this was for the time. Think about it. Transcendentalists were arguing that truth wasn't something handed down to you by old institutions like churches or governments. Nope. It was something you discovered for yourself, through your own intuition, your feelings, and your direct experience with nature. They were basically telling people, hey, look inward for guidance, look outward at the natural world, not back at some old authority figure.
Now, the leading voice of this whole movement was a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson. And his message, it was a powerful call to action. He urged Americans, and I'm quoting here, not to imitate European culture, but to create a distinctive American culture. He was the champion of self-reliance, and he basically gave Americans the philosophical green light to go out and invent something new, something entirely their own.
So if Emerson provided the theory, you could say his friend Henry David Thoreau provided the practice. I mean, to really put these ideas to the test, Thoreau went out, built a small cabin by Walden Pond, and for 2 years, he just lived simply. He stepped away from society to see what nature and solitude could actually teach him. And get this. This very personal experiment had some profound public consequences. Because Thoreau was convinced the U.S. war with Mexico was immoral, he refused to pay a tax that supported it. Now, he only spent 1 night in jail, but that single experience sparked his landmark essay on civil disobedience. And the core idea in there, that individuals have a moral duty to resist unjust laws, wow. That would become an incredibly powerful tool for social change, inspiring leaders like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. literally a century later. Now, this explosion of new ideas wasn't just limited to a few writers and thinkers. Oh no, it led to one of the most fascinating things from this whole era, the rise of utopian communities. People all over the country started creating these social laboratories, trying to build a perfect world in miniature. And the sheer variety of these places was just staggering. You had groups like the Shakers, who were all about religious purity. Then you had Brook Farm, which was a direct attempt to live out those transcendentalist ideals. And then you had places like Oneida and New Harmony, which were truly radical social experiments, challenging the basic ideas of private property, marriage, and capitalism. Now look, most of these communities eventually fizzled out, but they show you just how willing Americans were to rethink everything about society, right? From the ground up. So you've got this new sense of national pride, you've got this powerful new philosophy. It was really only a matter of time before all these abstract ideas started to take physical form. You start to see them in paintings, buildings, and books that just looked and felt, distinctly American. So let's start with painting. The big story here was the Hudson River School. This was America's first homegrown art movement. And what do you think they painted? It wasn't European cathedrals or stuffy portraits of kings. Nope. They painted the American wilderness.
But listen, this wasn't just about painting pretty landscapes. This was art as a philosophical statement. The painters of the Hudson River School were directly channeling that transcendentalist reverence for nature. They were portraying the American wilderness as this place of divine power and awe, something just as majestic and heroic as any fancy European cathedral. Architecture was making a big statement too, a political one. American designers looked way back to ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy, and started building in the Greek Revival style. All those grand columns you still see on old banks and government buildings, they weren't just for decoration. That was a very deliberate choice, a way to visually link America's new republic to the democratic ideals of the classical world. And finally, let's talk books, because American literature really came of age. For the first time ever, authors were telling distinctly American stories. You had writers like Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper creating these iconic characters and mythologies of the American landscape. And at the same time, you had others like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville who were using American settings to wrestle with these huge universal themes: sin, guilt, obsession. But they were doing it through a uniquely American lens. So what's the end result of all this cultural ferment? Well, by the mid-19th century, a uniquely American culture had clearly emerged. But its creation wasn't an endpoint. Oh no, it was really just the start of a new and much more complex chapter. So if you wanted the recipe for this new American identity, here it is. You take the patriotic fervor of a brand new nation, you mix in that transcendentalist belief in the power of the individual, and then you ground the whole thing in a deep fascination with the untamed American wilderness. That blend is what set it apart from Europe. But this brings us to a final and pretty crucial question. This new American culture celebrated two things at once: a shared national identity and the power of the individual. But at the exact same time, deep regional divisions were growing, especially over the issue of slavery. So you have to wonder, was this new culture really a force for unity? Or did its intense focus on individualism, ironically, help pave the way for the conflict that would nearly tear the entire nation apart? Thanks for watching.